Hey, what's going on, Bob? I'm just sharing the room a little bit. I'm about to get started with a little lesson here about
Yeah.
this guy's name is Professor Kloppenborg, and so he's one of these skeptical guys, but he's bringing out some information that I want to maybe talk about or just bring to light about the distortion of words, the way we think of words in the Bible, particularly when we talk about grace or we talk about church or whatever. And he goes into a little bit of this, so I think it'll be good for people to hear. But not only that, it's the issue of what I've been telling people the whole time with translations, that certain meanings have been accompanied with words in order to distort people's way of thinking. So just kind of going into to that a little bit and listening a little bit what this professor is saying about the time of when the New Testament was and everything like that. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I got a little cold. My voice don't sound quite like it should. But anyway, what you fixing to bring out is going to be better than what I was listening to with Cool Man and OJ and
Oh
Jordan
yeah.
or whoever it was. So thank you
Oh,
very
this
much.
is super interesting. He's not, this isn't like a real follower of Christ here. And, I try to tell these Trinitarians anyway, they're always talking about this scholar this and this theologian that and this professor that. But most of these guys, all of them don't even believe what these, want to be apologists like Cool Man and everybody else believes, or Yeshu Speaks or Al Bial or whoever else that likes to get into that, because most of these guys are unbelievers anyway, at heart.
Well, they
you know.
believe. Hey, they believe, but what they believed is lies. We got a whole bunch of lie believers, and you know that's a
Yeah, and they're
fact.
real skittish too. They're real scared of any real to get into any type of information that might, you know, undo their
Set them
little
free.
religious scene,
Set
right?
them free. Yeah, something to set them free. They run.
Hmm.
Go ahead. I'll mute up. I'll be listening.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm gonna start this. Like I said, we're here, and I think that you'll like this. I think that it's stimulating information. Just to tell you, this professor Koppenberg, he doesn't support my ideas, but I think it's interesting that this guy here, he's going to go into talking about how these specific words and specific languages, how people are not able to make the connections to what they really mean today because it's been so religiousized. All these words have been redefined. I'll give you an example. The word gay, Gay, in America. Well, the word gay used to be used in English to mean happy, right? Like I'm happy and gay, meaning, full of joy or jubilant or something of this night. Oh, it's a gay day. Like we'd say, oh, it's a wonderful day or something like this, right? Oh, look at this gay clothing you have on. But look how the word gay now, Gay, has turned into mean when you say gay, it means of a homosexual type preference in a sexual manner. So you say gay now does not carry the same connotation as gay then. For example, if somebody asks me, how am I doing today? And I look at them and I say, I'm gay, that they're going to take that as I'm a homosexual. You understand what I'm saying? But there was a time, let's say in the 1800s, where if somebody would just say, "How are you doing?" I'm gay. They understand that you mean you're happy. And see, the problem is now imagine that happened with the word church. Now imagine that happened with the word grace. Now imagine that happened with the word even Christ or whatever else you have. You see that people take so much for granted when they read the Bible. But when we've actually gotten deeper into these words and we have been studying the scripture, we found that a lot of people's quote definitions of these words are not the way they're being used in the biblical text. And we see this a lot. For example, when we go to like Hebrews chapter 1 and they always talk about Jesus being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. And I always say that word over there, hypostasis, it does not mean person. That does not mean person. And then they'll translate that word person. They'll translate it nature. They'll translate it essence. Maybe they even translate it being, Bing. But it doesn't mean any of that. That's not what that word means. And so, how did we get that word person in the Bible when the word hypostasis means quite literally a foundation? It's because of the way that they're redefining the words as time goes on, like the example I gave you with gay. And I'm using that example because I think that sticks out very strongly, doesn't it? Because you can see how a word can be so distorted that it takes on a totally different meaning. And that's what we're going to be talking about as we go into this lesson with Professor Kloppenborg, right? And seeing what he has to say about this. So when it comes to this word grace, which people translate favor or however you want to say it, unmerited favor or grace, the way that this was typically used in antiquity, as I've gone into you before, is much like you would see in Spanish when you say gracias. Gracias is grace, but see, that's a reciprocal thanks. Now, oftentimes it was used as gift in antiquity, and I've told y'all this. And what is it really talking about? It's one who is in the favor or in a standing with God or as a recipient of benefit. Now, today people use it in the sense of, oh, it's unmerited favor, and that's not the way it's necessarily. That's a new definition. They put a whole new meaning on it. See, and it can be associated with that. There could be overlap. But if we're going to get to precisely what this means and we want to understand what we're reading, we can't deal with the overlap. We need to deal with what the author, writer, intended use is. And this is what lexicons are trying to do for people. You see that people rely heavily on lexicons. You should not rely heavily on a lexicon. Lexicons in a lot of places are biased and arbitrary. It just is what it is. And more so when it comes to things specifically that we talk about concerning the person of Christ or the person of God. Okay. And that's why lexicons can get really crappy, to tell you the truth. So I wanted to use that stark difference of the word gay, Gay, that there was a time when a person would use that word to mean happy, wonderful. It's a gay day, you know. Oh, I'm having a gay time. Oh, you know, I'm wearing, as you see in your King James Version Bible, in the book of James, it says he has on gay apparel. I mean, you know, the rich man has on nice, wonderful clothing. But now today, that word has become so distorted, so twisted, that if we were to use it today, we know that most people are going to think of homosexuality. For an example, hey, how are you doing today, John? And John says, I'm gay. You're going to think he's a homosexual, not that he's happy. So, like I told you, when we take a look at certain words in the Bible, righteousness, justification, sanctification, certain words, even like God, God, even words that we take a look at as grace, these are important words. These are very important words in the Bible. But what I'm trying to tell you is, as time went on, these words began to be used in a different way. For example, church. And so Professor Kloppenborg, even though he is not a real devout follower of anything like this, I'm not using him for this. This is kind of my disclaimer. I want to show you how I came across this just early this morning, actually. Early this morning, I saw this. It's still kind of early for some people, but I want to share this. I want you to, he's going to go through and talk about these words, and I'll let him flow, but I will kind of stop here and there periodically to talk about some of the information. And I just think that you all might enjoy it. So we'll start here to show it, show you that a lot of people think I made it up. I've gotten tired of sharing resources, everybody. For those of you who are here for listening to the replays, everybody wants to know, where is that history? Give me that quote. Give me that source. Give me this, that. I'm tired of providing it. I'm not going to lie with you. It takes a lot of time for me to collect these sources and to give them to people, and everybody just says it's so arbitrary. Can you put it in the chat? Or, hey man, can you send that to me? And it takes a lot of hours, guys. And so anyway, this is Professor Copenberg. I'm not a professor of this stuff. He is, and he's going, hey, he's saying what I say, and he brings out a lot of good information here. So here we go. And if anybody who's able to listen, if you can hear well, give me a thumbs up. Or if you're having trouble hearing at some point, just hit an X. And so thank you. Sayings that indicate that Jesus is willing to associate with persons who have some level of disrepute. So tax collectors or toll collectors. Jesus says, to whom shall I compare this generation? We piped and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. For John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and you said he's demon possessed. that suggests that Jesus associated with persons of that particular group. Ignatius describes a Christ group using the terms that belong to Dionysiac associations. Christ bearers, Christophoroi, and you are Neaphoroi, temple bearers, and he uses a whole series of words that end with this suffix phoros or phoroi, a bearer. That's typical vocabulary of Dionysiac associations. The tendency of the genre is to seek a name. John the Baptist or Jesus and John the Baptist eventually got attached to these. No one really knew who they came from, but they sort of seek an author or seek a speaker. Um, that's possible, and as I say, one might propose even the same thing for the collection, the Aesop collection, that there's a series of sort of wise sayings, and at some point in the transmission of those sayings, somebody decides we really need a speaker for this, and let's invent this character called Aesop. The kind of famous saying that doesn't go back to the historical Jesus, at least in the form that we have it, is John 3, unless a person is born anothen, he cannot see the kingdom of God. A pun that's available only in Greek, not in Aramaic, would suggest to me that at least in this form, Jesus didn't say that. I'm just Now, so what he's getting into is the connection with Dionysic, like temple worship, right? Or even what you would see in the pagan areas of Dionysus, or when you would take a look at, he's getting into the words that you see later used by Ignatius, Christ bearer, temple bearer. There starts to be an evolution that you see happening in the church fathers, right? And I've pointed this out before as well. What does it mean? They're speaking differently than the people do in the New Testament, okay? And they're starting to use new formulations of words amalgamated within, reaching in to the pagan worship of counterparts that are alike, male figures that are alike, and associating this with Christ worship, right? And ultimately, we know they flow headlong into idolatry, right? And begin to worship the creature as the creator. They begin after a while to start worshiping Christ as God Almighty, right? Which is where we're at today. Um, when we take a look at further what he's saying about John 3:3, see this anothen, they put it in our Bibles as born again. And we've talked about this before. There's only one translation of the Bible that says from above, unless you are born from above. Now, we see that that actually fits the entire narrative of the Gospel of John. And we know why that's problematic. And we talked about that before in my classes about why it's problematic that those who are not born of flesh, those who are not born of blood, nor those who are born by the will of man, but of God, all come from above in the gospel or literature of John. And that's why even I myself was in a room not recently and somebody said, "Do you come from above?" It was, "Yes, you speak." And they laughed and mocked. Said, "According to the literature of John, I come from above and I'm not born of flesh and blood." And they found that to be highly problematic. And the reason why they find that to be highly problematic in their thinking is because they have fallen into that. You see, they've made distinctions that don't exist. Like somebody will say, "Oh, but you're begotten of God." You say, "Yes, I'm begotten of God." They say, "But Jesus is the only begotten of God. How can you be begotten of God?" And they don't know that those are even different words that don't mean the same thing at all. But see, they're both saying begotten. I pointed this out. Monogenes is speaking of, is not what we're dealing with, agenomai or agenao. You see, to be shired or begotten is not the same as monogenes. And so see, we're living in a day and age to where all these words have just been lumped together, mixed up in a pot and served as soup. Like there's just, it's not been defined properly. It's just a big mess, a hodgepodge, a mixed bag at this point. So this is what, when we see the introduction of a word that Jesus, did Jesus say the word anothen? See, this is what we should be thinking of anyway. Was he speaking Aramaic or what is he speaking Hebrew? What is the word that Yeshua would have said? And him being a rabbi, Think about how often people say that. Jesus being a rabbi, what would he have meant coming from his understanding of the study of the Torah in a Jewish realm of which he's supposed to be teaching? See, and that's what we do. That's what I do anyway. For those of you who want to understand the Bible, I go back to the Greek, I go back to the LXX, I go back to the Hebrew, and I show you the original meaning and content of what's being spoken of. And that's why when I speak from that original context of what was originally said, after that I've done the extensive study to figure out what each one of those things mean, what I come out with is something much different than what a lot of other people are saying. And so I'm often demonized as being a part of a cult or being demonized as a cult leader or all this stuff from these wacko religious dogmatic people. And I want y'all to understand that. I want you to understand how these people, they try to label people as cult leaders. They try to label people as religious fanatics. They try to, all this crazy stuff, but they're the ones doing this stuff. And you know why? Because not a part of the institution they're a part of. And these people are a part of institutionalized religion. And I've explained this before too, right? And that's what ecclesia is. These people, or church, church, right? Church is a word that is just not at all the way we say it, the way we would think about it if we were back in the time of Messiah, right? And so I'm going to continue on here. We're going to play a little bit more with that being said and hear more of what Professor here, Kloppenborg, has to say.
Thanks for the invitation. Absolutely. I'm so happy to have you here, and I think your book, Christ Associations, is it's a must read for people who are really trying to learn about early Christianity and its development. And also, I think you really did officially redefine that that term ecclesia. I think it's a redefined word now, whereas before you, this just was church. And now we're looking at this word and saying this might have some different meanings. In fact, let's start off with this: the term ecclesia. It's often translated as church. In your research, we can say about the use of ecclesia in early centuries of Christianity, and what was the overall function of Christ's assemblies in the Roman Empire? My reason in Christ's Association for offering somewhat different translations of a number of terms, including ecclesia, was that, in my view at least, when we adopt terms like church or grace or bishop to talk about early Christ groups, it immediately orients the reader to a certain, what I'll call a linguistic register, namely of a sort of a Christian church register, and separates the reader from the linguistic registers that the ancient reader would have had. So ecclesia is a perfectly normal term in Greek, and it means assembly. Synagogue similarly means assembly. So if we as scholars adopt the translation church, it in a way blocks from your imagination or blocks from your purview the normal sense that that word had, or those words had. Similarly with synagogue, if it's translated as synagogue, one immediately thinks, this really pertains only to Jews, right. And it's about particular practices that exist in the history of Judaism. The term is actually a normal term that means an assembly, a group of people who meet together for all sorts of different reasons. And I've made a similar kind of argument in the translation of a term like charis, which gets translated in Bibles and a lot of Christian discourse as grace. Now, grace is a term that really only has some salience or intelligibility within Christian theological circles. We don't any longer. use the term grace in normal discourse as we might have at the time of Shakespeare. But so it's a churchy word, and it immediately orients the person, the reader or the user, to a kind of church environment. Well, charis is a normal term in Greek that means gift, or um, or what you do when you reciprocate the reception of the reception of a gift. So I've tried to be careful in using what I would call normal translations of Greek words rather than churchy translations. And
now, why did he say that? Look at what Professor John Kloppenborg saying. He's saying, I've been very careful to use normal Greek translations instead of churchy translations. The proof is there. So what he's telling you is this: the Bibles that you're reading are religiously biased translations. And when I read the Bible, I can't read it like you read it because I wouldn't understand it like you don't understand it. That's what this professor's telling you. You know why? Because the words, when you read them, you associate the words with different images, different forms, different understandings, different meanings, and different definitions, different perspectives than the way it would have actually been used. And so when you read it, you're reading it from a totally different vantage point that didn't even exist. That's what the man's telling you, right? Now let's continue here.
that actually changes the way in which you think about all sorts of stuff in the first couple of centuries. If you call them Christ assemblies, that immediately at least creates the possibility for serious comparison with other kinds of assemblies, occupational guilds, assemblies of diasporic people, Thracians who live in Athens, or Judeans who live in Asia Minor. These were all called assemblies. Wow. And in fact, in the governance of Greek cities, their town council was called an ecclesia. So the ecclesia of the Athenians is the citizen assembly of Athenian males that made decisions. Similarly, the ecclesia of Thessaloniki was an assembly of probably Thessalonian males.
So why is this important, everybody? Because when you read in your Bible, principalities, dominions, powers, and authorities, and people associate them with spiritual wickedness and things like this, it's because these were the councils that were represented by male authoritative people, like your city councils today, people who make decisions. This is not like what you would think as people would have you to understand this stuff. You understand? When you're actually reading the New Testament, it's a highly treasonous book. They had to edit a lot of parts of it due to the fact it was so anti-Caesar. This is where you get to confess Jesus as Lord in comparison to actually Caesar at the time. In Romans 1, that's why they start with the genealogy of an earthly king. Like, people think they're just doing this for all theological reasons. It's ridiculous. Don't you understand that the Bible was political and sociological as well? But see, that's what's been yanked from people. See, and so now church and state are separate. They're not the same, you see. But the church state, if you want to say that, is the occupational authority from a Judaic mind frame because they're a theocracy. A theocracy. Their nation is a theocracy. That means that they're headed underneath, their chief deity is a god. America does this by lip service only. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But it's not true. They swear on the Bible, but we all know we don't live in a theocracy. We live in a amalgamation, right? Of a melting pot, as they would say, for the most part, where any religion can be served or worshipped, right? Or whatever principle, as long as it doesn't go against the status quo. But here, the main point is when we talk about this quote unquote third church at Thessalonica, or you might read in Thessalonians, we also see that there's other quote unquote ecclesias or councils being established too. Religion at this time was a way to really gravitate people to your culture, way of life, and supremacy of a nation. People aren't yet getting this. That's why the Jews were expelled numerous times. The Jews were expelled from Rome numerous times, one even being in your Bible, in the book of Acts. Why? Because they were people who were highly zealous in conversion and proselytizing and bringing people away from said systems in order to give tribute and or benefit unto Yahweh their God and unto the Jews. This was a big thing. The Greeks were somewhat different in that in the Hellenization period, even though the Greeks wanted people to be Hellenized, when they went into certain cultures, they still let the people retain their culture for the most part, even though they had the trade language of Koine Greek being used, established for a good portion. But when you actually take a look at some places like under Cyrus, for example, the Persians, he allowed the Jews to even build back their temple. So the Jews could build back their temple, but see, the Greeks were a little bit further than that. The Greeks actually would take cultures and they would uphold cultures. And I mean, God, look at Ptolemy, for example. Ptolemy, who was a Greek, who was one of the people who were in succession to Alexander, who took the region of Egypt, right near the Mediterranean. What he did was actually make himself a freaking pharaoh, and then he took upon himself all this stuff. Cleopatra, descends from this and all of that. And what's interesting about all this is when you take a look at this history and you actually look at what was going on at the time, this is totally left out of any discussion that we actually get into from a biblical realm. So I appreciate people like this professor who are going into this and being honest about it. And so I keep going from here.
Who participated in the governance of the city. So when you translate these Greek terms by what I would call their normal translations, it creates the possibility for you as an interpreter to start to make connections. You're not necessarily arguing that Christians borrowed these terms from other associations, but they used a term which would have automatically, for the Greek speaker, allowed for connections to both private associations that called themselves synagogae or ecclesia, and citizen assemblies that called themselves that same term. So that's kind of the methodological point in deliberately using those terms. And the point of the book, or the main point of the book, is to engage in what I call heuristic comparison. That is, to look at Christ groups and to put them, at least provisionally, in the context of other kinds of associations: cultic associations, occupational guilds, diasporic assemblies, neighborhood clubs, and so forth, and to ask, if we set Christ groups in that context, do we see something about Christ groups that we wouldn't have necessarily noticed if we kind of hive them off as a special category and call them churches? As soon as you call them a church, then it's much harder to compare them to anything else. So that's the point in engaging in that kind of comparison. That is very interesting. And do we see any other groups that call themselves assembly that are devotees of any other deities that we know of? There's a very, very small number of groups that call themselves ecclesiae. It's only 4 or 5 that we know that actually used that as a name. The we have more groups that call themselves synagogue, including a professional association or an occupational guild of barbers that they call themselves the synagogue of barbers.
Okay, so for those of you, I like to make things plain. All he's saying is trade schools. Those who you know who's trade schools, carpenters, barbers, whatever profession. Even if you get into certain things, you know, like beauticians or whatever else, they could go under certain auspices of synagogue. See, but people think of synagogue only associated with Jews. You see, and so what he's trying to say is this: when you get robbed of this, you lose the understanding and the associated words as they come to us, like that goes into a collegiate or a collegiate or even a college. You see, colleges where people learn, where the social, political, and economical views and principles of the culture is taught, and by which a nation is established, a culture, town, city. So we all live in cities, don't we? And on a city level, our city laws are different, aren't they? And so this is really what it's going into. But we see that later this begins to be associated with something that cannot be connected with this, in association with the word like church, that begins to be used exclusively in a new way that no one ever knew of, to what? Separate that as a religious aspect from social and political issues, right? Or economic issues, or whatever other issue you want to talk about. You see that? So here we go.
Which would just mean the barbers, the barbers local association. We know that there's a synagogue of Zeus, evidently devotees of Zeus. Is that the one in Pergamon? Just out of curiosity, just popped in my head. Yeah, in Pergamon, I think. Yeah. Oh, so that's probably what they're referring to in Revelation, then. It could well be. It could well be. Yeah. Interesting. And but association.
What he means there in Pergamon was in your book of Revelation, it's the word Pergamos because they don't go into it. But he says, I know where Satan's seat is. You know, and before that, we talk about the synagogue of Satan. So that's the reference that he's referring to.
Had a whole wide variety of terms by which to call themselves. In Latin, they would be called a collegium or a coetus, or simply cultores, simply the worshippers of X, of deity X. And in Greek, there was similarly a wide variety of terms that.
Right. You might know the Greek term like latreu, right? Like they always say divine worship. But also we would see proskuneo, which we've talked about before, which is prostration or translated worship, right? And we've talked about what these words mean. Like, for example, the people in quote unquote the Christ cult, they are also worship, that they will come and worship before thy feet and know that I have loved thee. So this is what Kloppenborg is getting into with the referent of cultus, going to a collegium, which I mean, today we would say something in association of a college, wouldn't we? Or something like a fraternity, or even a trade like he's brought up here with a barber, right? Or something that has to do with a body or school of knowledge. So I continue.
That groups used sometimes theazos, which we would just translate as, I think, a private association, or sometimes they named themselves after the deity. So the Serapiastai are the devotees of Serapis, and Christians eventually name themselves after Christ. They're called the Christianoi. So in that sense, Christ groups adopt some of the same naming practices that pagan associations of various sorts also used. Which makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like a default way of doing certain things. Yeah. Interesting. Very, very fascinating. I think this is really amazing material. So I want to switch over the gears a little bit because you do a lot of work on Q. And
It's so beautiful. I told you this would be a lovely, uh, dissertation here. When you talk about this with the Q source, for those of you who don't know, they say the Q source is basically like the father of Matthew and Luke. And they believe that Mark uh, and Q are the two oldest sources. This is just the two source hypothesis, basically. Mark and Q are the oldest. And both Matthew and Luke share from both Q and Mark, right? But Q is a hypothetical source. Q doesn't exist. Q is a reconstruction, or what people would call a reconstruction of what they believe is the most authentic, taken from, what is the shared information, basically. But we'll continue forward from here.
What is the process? People want to know, how do they, because a lot of people are looking at Q and just like, where are they getting this from?
Where does this come from?
Yeah, well, so what's the process for scholars and how do they decide on what the Q sayings are?
Okay, so Q is a hypothetical document. That is, we don't have a papyrus copy of it, but it can be reconstructed, or it is reconstructed from what you can think of as the two successor documents that used it. That is Matthew and Luke, and at least on the two document hypothesis, which is still by far the most common way of thinking about the literary relationships among the three Gospels. Mark is the earliest and the source, the literary source that Matthew and Luke used.
I don't know. Man, we need to get David in here, don't we? David thinks that Luke is the oldest. All right, so let's keep going.
In order to construct their Gospels. But Matthew and Luke very clearly had a document that is not Mark, because Mark does not contain most of the stuff that Matthew and Luke share. And that document, because we don't actually know how it called itself, we call it Q, which simply means that is the initial for the German word Quelle, source. So the way I kind of explain this to my students is that you can think of Matthew and Luke's literary composition on the analogy of two different authors who had, let's say, a narrative biography of Socrates, and they had a collection of sayings of Socrates. And Matthew and Luke, or these two hypothetical editors, then were decided that they were going to combine those two sources, a narrative of Socrates and his sayings, into a more comprehensive biography. And they did that. So that's essentially what Matthew and Luke are doing. They've got two literary sources. They've got the Gospel of Mark, and they've got this other document, which is principally sayings of Jesus, and they combine them. Interestingly, they combine them in different ways. So Matthew's choices in combining these two documents are different from Luke's choices. Matthew has a stronger tendency to conflate sayings, that is, take a Q saying and join it to a Markan context, whereas Luke has more the tendency to edit a chunk of Mark for a while and then switch to a chunk of Q, and so you get.
I agree with the old professor here, to tell you the truth. That this a lot of stuff that's being brought out here is very accurate. That's why if you look at these diagrams, they're extremely thought out when it comes to exactly what percentage of information is actually shared between these documents. I mean, people have put a lot of time into this stuff. Doesn't mean they're right necessarily, but I would like, a lot of textual analysis and textual argumentation have been brought up lately, But what's interesting is, I don't think that people have really researched into why a lot of these methods, or the methodology that's been used to come up with these models, such as, the Q source, right? Um, and using that as a partner with Mark, that Matthew and Luke are both extrapolating information from, and how are they even coming to this thought process? Well, when you read Matthew, the argument here that he's saying is you can clearly see that he's taking portions within Mark, Matthew, and a source. Q source is what's being the hypothetical in this, right? And of course is elaborating or being more exhaustive, or that's probably a nice way to say it. Another way to say it is to be more exaggerative, in filling or in developing further into the narrative that he's conveying and using that information to do so, right? And we do see that Matthew's unique as compared to something like Luke, clearly, and that's why the professor here is saying that Luke is doing it for other reasons. So we can, just so you can follow along, it's very simple what he's saying here. And this is important because remember, when we talk about the way words are being used today, where this is where this all started, when we talk about the way that people view this time period, the way that words were being used in this time period, the way they would have been conveyed and understood. Also, when it comes down to what we see even here of the methodology of the writers of the New Testament, right? And so we're going to keep going into this deeper. And if anybody wants to ask any questions or anything like that, or something's not so clear, you can always raise your hand or use that waving hand, emoji or whatever. But here we'll get started here.
We call it chunking. Several paragraphs of Mark, and then several paragraphs of Q, and then back to Mark, and then back to Q, and so forth. So, whereas Matthew is more of a kind of micro conflator who takes a particular saying of Q and sticks it into the middle of a Markan saying. But the general point is they actually treat their two sources differently. They combine their two different sources differently. Now that poses a challenge for us in reconstructing this second source. We've got Mark, and so you can look at how Matthew edited Mark, and you can look how Luke edited Mark, and then you can look at the materials that Matthew and Luke have in common that they didn't get from Mark. So, for example, the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 and in Luke 6. There's a lot of overlap there between Matthew and Luke, and we hypothesize that overlap is due to their common use of this Q document. Now, since we can look,
Just listen to the language, everybody. We hypothesize that because they're using the same Q document. I mean, notice how all these professors, when you hear these guys at this type of level, I want y'all to understand, you're not hearing them even entertain the idea that Luke and Matthew maybe were actually, Matthew was an eyewitness and Luke is getting it from an eyewitness. Notice how they're not even thinking like that at all. Like, they're not like, oh, yeah, Matthew's an eyewitness, so of course he sat there and he heard Jesus say it in Matthew 5, the Beatitudes. And Luke, he had spoken to eyewitnesses and compiled things from eyewitnesses. So in Luke chapter 6, yeah, of course there's overlap there. No. Look, see, there's overlap because there's another source, another document. Why are they saying that? Because they think these things are actually written later. That's why. And when you get to this level with these guys, and this is the ones who Yeshu speaks, and Mr. D, and whoever else wants to hop in and talk about church fathers, and who want to talk about theologians and what scholar, etc., they hide this stuff. These scholars do not believe. Look, they wanted to say the other day that they didn't want to talk with David. Yeshu speaks it. Oh, well, David, you say this, but you hold the Bible as your source, but you say you don't even believe in the Bible, so there's nowhere I can go with you, blah, blah, blah. That's ridiculous because these theologians, they believe that Timothy, the pastoral letters are all pseudo. I mean, you're going to be hard pressed. I mean, you're going to find some really type of rigid type religious guys, maybe some real Baptist or something, maybe some scholars that would go against those types of things. Even 1 John 5:7. Do you know what I mean? You're going to find those guys who are whacked out. You know, you're going to find guys, maybe scholars who say 1 John 5:7, who may still be holding on to an inkling because they are so just religiously dogmatic that they'll try to defend those things. And you see people in here try to do it sometimes too. But the point is, when we talk about scholarship, by and large, 1 John 5:7 is not a part of the original text of 1 John. Okay. So what's important to recognize with something like this is that when you take a look at these scholars, they're going to tell you the pastoral letters are pseudo. So that's like 2 Peter, that's like 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, some other writings like Colossians and whatever else. You could go on down the list. Pretty much the great majority of stuff that you have. Okay, writers of Hebrews, anonymous authors, speculations, all these things. So the point is, as we're listening further, I just want to point that out. Okay. When you hear these people in these rooms talk about, well, what scholar says that? Where do you get your source? What sort? Keep in mind that all these scholars, most of the people they're even going to, God, imagine when they even use Boryar and whoever else that don't even believe in their same God, like who denied Christ, but who quite literally, by definition of the New Testament, Antichrist. Um, if you want to be religiously dogmatic and dog-minded. But the point is, what do you see? Well, they'll use these people's material. And people like myself will have to interact with people I don't even care for, never met, shouldn't even matter, or their works like Daniel Boyarin. But when it comes to other people, like, I think, I'm just using David as an example, because he's been the point of topic of controversy lately with things that he said. But, they don't interact with him. Why? Because he denies that Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2, apart from the first 4 verses, roughly, is not authentic to the Gospel of Luke. And so he's denied the virgin birth and whatever else from these things that he's come to hold as true. And that wasn't a part of original text. And I guess that also the original community never thought anything like this. Or at least the people who Luke is dealing with, right? But when we take a look at that and look how much criticism, you know, but they're using all these other guys and hold them in such high respect. Why? Because they have a piece of paper, because they have a degree in a certain. Oh, this is ridiculous. But hey, such is the way of men, right? So I'm going to continue to play this here.
At how Matthew edits Mark, you can get an idea of what kinds of things.
I mean, my God, just listen. How Matthew edits Mark. Look, that man just said this nonchalantly. Oh, how Matthew edits Mark. Imagine if David said this. I'm not defending David. Just imagine if I said it, or anybody else, Abiel or Zero, or Denise or Blossom or whoever else. Just imagine. You say, oh, you just say nonchalantly. Oh, like Matthew edits Mark. Just you could imagine Yeshu speaks or one of these other guys. These apologists. I'm gonna stop saying names now. But you could imagine one of these apologists, right? They they would have a fit, Whoa, whoa, whoa! Where's your source to say that Matthew edited Mark? Where would you get that from? And so and you got to spend all this time. And like I said, I'm just tired of providing sources. I'm just not big on it anyway. People like Divine, man, Divine Prospect's great for that. Divine Prospect, he's the type of guy, he didn't mind spending hours and hours and hours a day, it would seem like sometimes, to send information and to provide sources and to take that time to sit there and put it in the chat and to post it at the top. But me, man, I do enough just to eat it all and to spill it out to you. That takes enough for me. I have other stuff, But here I want to play this for you all. Here you go.
He's likely to do. So a simple example is that in talking about the kingdom, Mark uses the term kingdom of God, and Matthew tends to convert this to kingdom of the heavens. Heavens being a kind of pious circumlocution of the name God. So when you see Matthew repetitively doing this, And then you see in a Q context where Matthew has kingdom of the heavens and Luke has kingdom of God, we would assume that probably what's happened is that Matthew has also taken a Q saying which had kingdom of God and did what he normally does with Mark as well and convert that to kingdom of the heavens. So in other words, you use the comparison of Matthew's treatment of Mark and Luke's treatment of Mark as a way of arriving at a set of, let's call them editorial policies that both writers have. And so when you see one of those editorial policies showing up in the Matthew-Luke material, then you can say, well, that's perhaps Luke doing the changing.
And I personally agree with this hypothesis stronger than a lot of so-called Unitarians, like that there's one person they use Luke specifically, and I've looked at some of their teachings here recently, but it's so unthorough. I think the reason why is because it's just so more well collected and organized as a literary work that it would seem, but as the original, I mean, something like that would seem to become later, like a work like that that's so pristine would seem to emerge out of something that comes later, meaning like the earliest, so-called followers of Christ or whatever they were called at this time, when we still with the sect of the Nazarenes, we could say, or the followers of the way. Those Jews who followed Jesus of Nazareth, they wouldn't have had such, you know, educational level of this sort with Greek. That's why when they also look at some of these manuscripts, they tend to want to side, and oftentimes do, with the older style of writing or the less pristine writing as older. And that's kind of with the dating that they have also, that sometimes goes into it. But if anybody has any questions, want to make any comments, again, all you got to do is just put up that raising hand, that waving hand, and I'm going to keep going from here.
Or Matthew doing the changing. But the procedure itself, I don't know if this is going to come off if I show it to you. Yeah. So this is the critical edition of Q. Let me see. There we go. So what the critical edition of Q does is it offers some columns that allow us to compare closely Matthew and Luke's reading, and we've also added the Gospel of Thomas, where there's a Thomas parallel.
That's right, the Gospel of Thomas. Shout out. Now, when we take a look at these things, the Gospel of Thomas, the sayings, those collected sayings, or this suspected Q source. I mean, a Q source would have probably looked like a Gospel of Thomas. A Q source that the hypothetical is that it was a compiled sayings, and that's kind of the Gospel of Thomas is compiled sayings. Now, what's important, and I'll play this again. If you want to Google what he said about the Q source being in columns, you can actually look at that yourself. And it's great to take a look at these things. So I'll play this again and just pay attention to what he calls this here.
The critical edition of Q, let me see, there we go.
The critical edition of Q. Okay. So if you want to look that up, maybe just put that in your back for some late night reading or something like that to put you to sleep. The critical edition of Q, it's a cool diagram to look at. They kind of do break things into columns and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. But here we go. And remember, just raise your hand if you want to say anything, comments, whatever.
Yeah. So what the critical edition of Q does is it offers some columns that allow us to compare closely Matthew and Luke's reading, and we've also added the Gospel of Thomas, where there's a Thomas parallel. And wow. So you can read across the page. There's a Markan column as well. So you have Matthew, Matthew, Luke, Mark, and Thomas. The Markan column is usually empty because there's no Markan saying at all. But so you can compare Luke's wording, Matthew's wording, and if you've got Thomas or something else that's a parallel, you can compare them. And using the principles that I just identified, that is, when we know something about Matthew's tendency as an editor and Luke's tendencies of an editor, you can use that to arrive at what we think is the closer to the source that both of them are using. So this then amounts to about 4,000 words of text that Matthew and Luke share. And the International Q Project that produced this enormous book of 500 pages or something like that. Wow. It basically simply is a tool. It offers it offers a tool for people to use, a tool that allows them to see Matthew, Mark, Luke, Thomas, and anything else that seems parallel. And then you can see at the bottom of the page.
And you see that this is what I've told you all. This is where you end up with scholarship. With scholarship, you end up with the critical addition of Q. Okay, and look, David is a person who's just taking what these scholars are actually saying. I mean, these are the forgotten about scholarship here. This, like he says, this extensive work is all to show you that these authors that you're seeing, what you're reading in your New Testament, is not like Matthew was just sitting down saying, let me recall by the Holy Spirit everything I saw Jesus do. You see how that's not at all what this guy's saying? They're saying the editors of former information. Okay? Now, this is when you get ostracized for saying what the scholars say on a place like Clubhouse. Say that on Clubhouse and be a so-called follower of Christ, and look at what happens to you. But these guys are the ones who they're relying on for their work. To me, it's the utmost form of hypocrisy. But here, I continue.
Page, what the International Q Project has proposed as the reconstruction of Q in Greek, and then there's an English, German, and French translation of it as well.
Hey, that's why people love Eliyahu, man. I bring it back to the old school. Okay. Hey, look, all these young bucks, they're coming up. Look, just bring out the international Q source, man, in this society. What are they going to do? They're going to deny all this body of work. This is their so-called Christendom today. These are their theologians. Okay. Mm.
So it gives the reader an idea of what the IQP has thought probably is the more likely reading of Q. And as I say, this then amounts to about 4,000 words of text, or if you convert this into verses, something like 230 biblical verses. We also make decisions about the relative sequencing of Q, because sometimes Matthew and Luke disagree in the order in which they report Q sayings, and we have to take into account the same kind of editorial procedures. Matthew tends to be much more likely to move Mark and pericope around than Luke does, and that perhaps suggests that Matthew is more likely to move to that Matthew is more likely to move Mark and pericope around, that is, relocate them sequentially for his own purposes, than Luke is. Luke tends to take Mark in the order he finds it, and we suggest again that likewise Matthew is more likely to move Q stuff around sequentially, and Luke more likely simply to take it in the order in which he sees it. So that allows us to come up with at least a kind of provisional sequencing of Q sayings.
Now, this wasn't in the questions list, but I just thought of it. When does, because Thomas is kind of a sayings document in its own right.
Yes.
When does that come along? And is that a later text, or is this around the same time?
That's really hard to know. The advantage we have with Q is that it has to be earlier than Matthew and Luke because they both use it. Now, dating Matthew and Luke is itself not an easy job. Matthew is usually dated sometime in the 80s or the 90s, and Luke now in the early.
Good God, man. He said Matthew is in the 80s and 90s. Good God, man. Y'all know how late that is? You know, commonly in most of your Bibles, it's going to say 50 CE. It's going to say the Gospel of Matthew. It's going to put it at 50 CE. Good God, man. 80, 90 CE? Hey, I'm just saying, imagine if you said that on Clubhouse, y'all. You know, like, you're on Clubhouse and you're like, well, you know, that Matthean document you have there, sir, is 80, 90 CE. So,
Don't give me any ideas.
what'd you say, brother?
Don't give me any ideas.
All right, so we keep going with the professor here. I think he might know what he's talking about. So
110s or something like that. So Q has to be earlier than those two. The difficulty with Thomas is in the 80s or the 90s, and Luke now in the early 110s or something like that. So Q has to be earlier than those two.
good God. Early 110s.
The difficulty with Thomas is that there's really no datable historical references in Thomas that allow you to say this has to have been written after the destruction of the temple, or it has to have been written after such and such a date. There's no historical references in it at all. So it leaves it rather questionable. The earliest manuscript that we have of Thomas is about the end of the 2nd century, but that's actually no different than our earliest manuscripts of Matthew, also at the early end of the 2nd century. So the earliest attestation doesn't really help you date it any more than it does with Matthew and Luke. So the datings, I mean, scholars have usually said for Thomas sometime in the 2nd century. That's 100 years, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty vague. And there's a few colleagues, John Dominic Crossan and others, who have suggested that Thomas is much earlier than that, sometime maybe as early as 60. It's really difficult to come up with a very convincing date for Thomas because, as I say, it doesn't have any pegs that allow you to hook it to a datable event. All that we can say is that it's before the 3rd century because that's when we first.
Well, for those of you who don't know, when it's hard to peg something to a datable event, it's usually because that's in the conception of what is original. What that means is something that is spawned by which other things are later developed from. Just saying. Now, do I think so? Not so much, but in my studies of the Gospel of Thomas and in connection with certain type of Johannine literature, such as the things that I bring out in the sayings of John, when you see the ancient psalm or hymn, as they would say, that is used there, they say that even goes back, they say, to the earliest times, contemporary to Christ, right? Like they're trying to say here that people surmise the Gospel of Thomas is as early as 50 CE, but they can't determine that. You see, it's all guesswork when it comes to that. But why? Because they see, like, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, you have the narrative of the vineyard in there, like, and how the kingdom, how they would try to seize it. So that's really early, right? You find that in Matthew, right? For example. And so, but they're like, but how they can't really tell if that was extrapolated from an earlier source or what. Like they're just putting it up in the air now. Well, the reason why is because there's so many sayings that are in Thomas that are not in Matthew, that are not in Luke, okay, and that are not even in John. And so when they have their Q source or the hypothetical of their Q source, they see overlap also in certain documents like that, but it's kind of a conundrum for them, you see, because most typically things like that are thought to be more or less later in Gnostic. But as more information and critical analysis is being done of a lot of the evidence and subject matter that we have, many people have abandoned the thought that the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic at all. And so, it used to be people would say, "Oh, this is Gnostic," but now that no, that's not Gnostic, and they give their reason. So that's why it's something like that is perplexing to them. But I'll continue on.
Start getting manuscripts of it, and the full Coptic version is from Nag Hammadi, and the latest possible date for that is 348, because that's the dating of the kind of junk papyri that have been used in the Nag Hammadi codices to produce the covers. So you pull apart what's called the cartonnage, and you look at the junk papyri in there, and some of those have dates, and the latest date is in the middle of the 4th century. So obviously the Coptic version is produced sometime before the early 4th century, but that gives us an enormous scope, right?
Right.
The other issue that comes up with the Gospel of Thomas is, does it know the synoptic Gospels? If for example, you could show that the Gospel of Thomas knows Luke or knows Matthew, then you would have an earliest possible date for its composition. And that debate has sort of gone back and forth. I think I'm one of those people who think that there's at least some sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that show no dependence at all on the synoptic Gospels,
right?
Which means that potentially, say, the parable of the tenants, which is Thomas 65, could be as early as Mark as a saying. Now, when it actually got incorporated into a text called the Gospel of Thomas, that's really unknowable, I think, except sometime in the 2nd century or perhaps a bit earlier. So that's not a very satisfying answer, but I think given the nature of the data that we have, that's about all that can be said responsibly.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the questions I'm running into with people that I think are good questions is like, we date Paul before these Gospels, and some people say 40s, some people say 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
But he's writing to churches that are in Macedonia. He's writing to churches that are in Anatolia, and so there already is a network of these associations.
Yes,
and the question is like, what are they reading? Are they just oral? What do they know about Jesus? What do they believe about it? It's like Paul doesn't give us that much. He just sort of it comes off as like a real letter, actually. Makes me think that it's a real letter because it's just so like random on some places that
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Paul never mentions the miracles of Jesus. Does that mean that he doesn't know them, or that he doesn't use them as illustrations, or that does it mean that, say, those in Corinth or those in Thessaloniki or other towns, they also don't know that Jesus is a miracle worker? If he doesn't say anything, then it's very difficult to be certain about either what he knows or what his correspondents know as kind of common knowledge. As you indicated just at the beginning, of course, Paul is not going to repeat information that he already knows that his recipients know. You don't do that in a letter. Exactly. But that leaves us with a real problem. He does cite a few sayings of Jesus, and he attributes them to Jesus. So the saying on divorce is attributed. He says he's got this from the Lord. Now that's a saying that shows up both in Mark and in Q. the prohibition of marriage after divorce. Uh, uh, and he's also got this saying about the servant or of the minister of the gospel being worthy of his hire. That's in 1 Corinthians. And he's got also the words of institution for the Last Supper, which doesn't occur in Q as far as we know, but it certainly occurs in Mark.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah. So now Mark is already too late for him to know it, but he evidently knows some of those sayings, probably orally, from oral.
Yeah, you see, this guy says Mark is too late for him to know it. See how these guys think. I just want to keep pointing this out again. So why would these apologists be upset? For example, they're not like, well, Paul went and talked to Mark in Jerusalem, or Paul was with Peter and Mark, and so when he's writing, clearly he's been told this. No, they're like, he doesn't know this document that is Mark. And the reason why they're even saying that is because if there was some type of proto-Mark that he would even been using Paul, they're saying that this has been edited because they clearly see that information that's provided when we take a look at what they're saying, hypothesizing Q or the Gospel of Thomas. All of these writings are speculating these things. Now, the best model that they've come up with is what he's already explained extensively, so I'm not going to go into that they've come up with, and that's their model of how the letters are written, the synoptic gospels are written, and the explanation of why they will talk about a Q source, which many people, might not even know about, or really have studied about. But we'll keep going with this here. And again, if anybody wants to add any information, ask questions, or whatever, make comments, just hit that yellow raising hand. All right, here we go.
Oral tradition. So I suppose that Paul has some idea of things that Jesus said, and he very occasionally cites them. I mean, it's really interesting how seldom he cites Jesus. If he knew the whole contents of Q or the tradition that ultimately goes into Luke or Matthew, it's kind of curious that he just doesn't ever cite it, even when it might have been useful for him to cite it. And as I say, there's no evidence of he doesn't appeal to miracles. He talks about his own miracles or his own mighty acts, but never says, "Oh, Jesus did these things too," or "I'm doing the things that Jesus did." And we don't get any of that. So that leaves us questioning about whether he knows much about that tradition. And of course, he's not a direct disciple of Jesus. He already belongs to the kind of second tier.
Right, and that's where this mystery lies. Is like, we don't have gospels yet, but we do have a network of assemblies,
groups.
So it's like, what are they believing? What are they thinking about? And I think a lot of times I've run into this piece of the puzzle that I think people aren't talking about is there's these Hypsisterians, Greek monotheists, and I wonder if
Greek monotheist, that's like theos hypsistos. If y'all see me like in the debate I did with hypsistos, it means most high. So the term theos hypsistos just means most high or most high God, and they're saying that there was a pagan monotheism, and so that pagan monotheism is what this guy's talking about. So I think it arose in 90 CE or something like that, right?
network was already there, and then someone like Jesus comes along. But then once you start thinking about that, you're like, well, then why are we waiting so long till Josephus and Tacitus to even hear about him in any of the sources? It's just it's a mystery. It is.
Yes, these groups of devotees of Theos Hypsistos are really quite interesting. We find them mostly in Thrace, in Macedonia, some in Asia Minor, and a few in Greece. There's a couple that show up in other parts, but especially around the north shore of the Black Sea, there's lots and lots of them. I've got doctoral student who's working, among other things, on Theos Hypsistos groups. And this is one of these interesting examples where we know that there are many groups. We know their names. We know we've got membership lists. We know who belong to them. But we don't know much about what they believed. I mean, it would be nice to have a document like a gospel from one of these groups that told us exactly what they, what they think Theos Hypsistos is about. That said, though, there's still some really interesting features about these Hypsisterian groups. They tend not to offer iconic representations of the deity. Sometimes all that's indicated is an eagle or a star on their.
I mean, and isn't that interesting? Because this Greek monotheism, which was, the Theos Hypsistos right over there worshiping by symbols of a deity of whether an eagle, also a star. Which, if you look at the star, it looks like a freaking pentagram. I think, like an upside down pentagram. But on the other side, it has a man with ram horns on his head, which is like conducive of that depiction of Moses type iconic imagery, right? Like Moses came down with the beams, it says, coming out, right? But if you notice in ancient art and whatever, they have horns on Moses's head, like an animal horns. But so they're talking about, we don't know a whole lot about this. We wish they have given more, but they're saying that even within the worship, they didn't use icons or images. And so it's certain, whatever images they did find is what he's explaining.
On their inscription. So rather than actually giving us a picture of what Theos Hypsistos is like, we get aniconic representations. That has invited, for some scholars, think that there may be some kind of connection with Jewish groups, because, of course, the Septuagint calls God, among other things, Hypsistos, the Most High. Now, I don't think that there's enough of the connections between the Theos Hypsistos inscriptions that we have and Jewish inscriptions to say it's the same, or even that one has influenced the other. Hypsistos is simply a nice epithet that is the Most High, or the best, and there's certainly a tendency in the Hellenistic period when you name your god to attach a superlative to it. So Jupiter is called Optimus, that is the best, the biggest and the best. And we have other groups that use similar superlatives, including words like Hypsistos, to describe their deity. So don't think the fact that the Hypsisterians and Jews use the same term necessarily creates a connection. However, it really is, it's quite interesting that many of the Hypsisterian inscriptions do not seem to have been produced in professional workshops. They're more of the line of an inscription that is cut by someone who basically is literate but doesn't really know the techniques of how you produce a beautiful calligraphic kind of inscription. So that suggests groups that are lower on the economic scale. They also tend to be gender inclusive, and inclusive of persons of a variety of social ranks or social registers. There's a very interesting inscription from Veroia. It's in northern Greece, where a number of the members of this group are identified as artisans, nail makers, and things like that. And there's others who probably are slaves, and there's at least two who are Roman citizens. That's that kind of complexion of a group starts to look a little bit like what we would imagine, say, the Corinthian group to consist of. Some persons who perhaps have Roman citizenship, others who are artisans. There's certainly slaves in the Corinthian group. So what's, I'm not suggesting that there's a genetic relationship between Hypsisterian groups and Christ groups, but there's some interesting parallels that might suggest that these groups might, in some ways, have looked the same. In terms of their complexion. But as I said at the beginning, it would be really nice to know what the Hypsisterians actually believed, what kind of rituals they engaged in, and we don't know much about that at all.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with this Roman inscription from 139 BCE about the Jews getting kicked out of Rome for attempting to infect. I'm reading Wikipedia right now. Infect the Roman custom with the cult of Jupiter Sabbatios.
Yeah, Sabbatios. Yeah.
And the reason why I bring that up is because in Phrygia, this god is really popular. This is also where you see these Theos Hypsistos groups located as well. Do you is it possible that there might be something going on here, or is this just not enough to know?
That's another one of these cases where there's not enough to know. There is a cult of Sabbatios, and the word, it's the name itself with the SAB beginning, right, has suggested that does this have something to do with the Shabbat? Well, that's a connection that is very difficult to make in any kind of convincing way.
Yeah, because nobody actually says it outright. There's nobody.
No, they don't.
That would help.
It's an easy confusion to make, and it's not only an easy confusion for us, but you might imagine that ancient people also seeing Sabbatios might have said, well, these are Jews.
Good point.
I don't think that the cult of Sabbatios is a Jewish cult, but the name certainly kind of invites a comparison or a confusion or a conflation of those two. But what you're looking at there is the kind of xenophobia that one sees
exactly
in Rome, where foreign cults enter Rome. And there's a couple of them that were welcomed. The cult of the Great Mother was actually welcomed, and she gets a temple on the Palatine Hill. But ISIS has some real trouble getting established in Rome. There's deep suspicion about the cult of ISIS because of its Egyptian origins, especially at the time of the conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony.
Because I think they depicted themselves as Isis and Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly right. And Octavian, later called Augustus, for political reasons, doesn't want to do that. And
right.
So there's a problem with the reception of the cult of Isis, but it later gets embraced in Rome, and we've got temples of Isis. In Pompeii, there's a nice temple of Isis, so it seems to have made its way in. And Jews have the same kinds of problems. That is, they're welcomed, but they run into difficulties from time to time, and exactly the same thing with Christians at the time of, say, Pliny, or maybe even Domitian, and later they anything that looks foreign, that involves foreign-looking deities and odd practices, immediately comes under suspicion.
Wow, this is interesting stuff. So the next question that people are asking is, if we establish that these Q sayings are coming from a common source of a group of sayings that somebody said, that begs the question, does that mean Jesus actually, this proves he existed? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if all we had was Q, I'd say the answer would be, it certainly doesn't prove it. It doesn't exclude Jesus' existence, but we've got sayings of Aesop. Was Aesop a real person, or is this a fabricated person? A slave who has all this wisdom. Well, I don't know that anyone has ever tried to make a strong argument that Aesop actually existed. In some sense, he becomes a name to which you attach sayings. And was there a historical Aesop? And did he actually say anything? I don't know. I'm not sure how you'd make that argument.
He is considered one of the 7 sages of, is it Greece, I think, or Hellas? And I think he's on a list with other people who are historical, but
yeah, he's not traditionally one of the seven sages. That's
oh, okay.
But he gets added to that.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that's right. So as I say, if all we had was Q, I think we would be basically in the same situation as we were with Aesop and a number of other persons. Now with Q, or with Jesus, our sources about Jesus come from multiple, we think, independent sources. So Mark and Q, I think, are independent of one another. They both talk about Jesus. Paul, even though he doesn't say very much about Jesus' sayings, there's no reason not to think that Paul thinks that Jesus was a real person. He puts a lot of stake in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the death certainly means that he was a real person. Then we have the Gospel of Thomas, and we have a couple of other sources as well. So when you get several independent sources, all of which belong to, let's say, the first century, talking about a person, I think it's a relatively safe bet to think that person existed. An analogy to this would be Socrates. We don't just have Plato's word for Socrates. We have a negative portrait of Socrates in Aristophanes' The Clouds. And we've got Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is all about Socrates. So you've got three different ancient reporters who talk about Socrates as a real person. And I don't know that we have any classic scholars or scholars of ancient philosophy who doubt that Socrates existed. Now, that doesn't mean that the sayings that are attributed to Socrates are what Socrates said. So it's pretty clear that Plato might have some Socratic sayings, but he's taken Socrates way beyond what the historical Socrates probably said. Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates, so you get a kind of polemical representation of him. And Xenophon is more a follower who gives a record of some of the things that Socrates said. But with both Socrates and Jesus, we're in the situation of having multiple sources that don't always agree with one another, and one then has to do some filtering to sort out which likely go back to the historical Socrates or the historical Jesus. But as I say, I think our situation with Jesus is not very different from that with Socrates. I think it's not a reasonable thing to doubt that Jesus existed, given the number of ancient documents that take for granted that he exists. But that it's a very different question whether we actually know what we know about, or what we think we know about what he said. That's a different matter entirely, because you've got disagreements. And some serious disagreements.
Yeah, that's a good point. But so, would it make sense then for people to write sayings, and then these sayings end up being in common throughout these sources if someone just made this all up? Somebody wrote some sayings that aren't really attributed to anybody in particular. They're like a collection of sayings from different people over time. They put it into one place and then made it into a person, and then those sayings got. Is that like, which one do you think is more likely?
Well, I think both are probable. The early work that I did on Q, which came out as the formation of Q, tried to locate Q in the context of ancient sayings collections, and of which we've got lots. Proverbs, Sirach are two of the Jewish collections, but we've got Anak Shashank and Amenemope from Egypt, and Merikare. We've got a number of Babylonian collections. Sentences of Aesop are the same. We've got a number of Greek and Latin collections, basically wise sayings attributed to various wise persons. And what I noticed when I started working through this hundreds of collections is that they typically all are connected to a person. That is, it seemed to be in the genre of sayings collections that you couldn't just have an anonymous collection of sayings. There was a very strong tendency to attach them to a name. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that the name to which they're attached is a reliable name. I mean, we've got various versions of the sayings of the seven sages. They're different sayings, but they're all connected to the same sages. Now, I think theoretically, one might propose that there was originally a set of anonymous sayings, wise sayings, and since the tendency of the genre is to seek a name, that the name Jesus or the name John the Baptist or Jesus and John the Baptist eventually got attached to these because no one really knew who they came from. But sayings have, they sort of seek an author or seek a speaker. That's possible. And as I say, one might propose even the same thing for the collection, the Aesop collection, that there's a series of sort of wise sayings, and at some point in the transmission of those sayings, somebody decides we really need a speaker for this, and let's invent this character called Aesop. Or maybe there is somebody named Aesop who, it's just a name, and they attach it. I think that's possible, but it's equally possible that that the collection of sayings preserve a memory, some kind of memory that Jesus actually said some of them, and then the collection gets created by the kind of accretion of other sayings to a core of sayings that actually do go back to Jesus. I think an argument could be made in both directions, and there's almost no way for us to decide which is the more probable.
Good point. Yeah, good answer. I just thought of this too. This is just an extra side thing, is that when you get people like Celsus in the 2nd century who are hostile, you don't hear them ever saying, this didn't happen. It's always, in fact, you get traditions that are strange about his father being a Roman soldier named Pantera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that before I go to the next question?
Yeah, that's right. It's certainly Celsus thinks that Jesus existed. Now, he thinks he was a magician, thinks that he learned his craft. Basically, he learned the kind of deception that he thinks Egyptian magicians typically practice. So he doesn't doubt that Jesus existed. He just despises his credentials as somebody that's actually worth listening to. And certainly not worth revering as a deity or as a holy person.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read that kind of stuff. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, meaning, like, let's say that we decide that these sayings were written by somebody, and that person probably is Jesus. Put that aside for now. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 meaning Jesus probably said it, and then 1 meaning he probably didn't say it. Which of these sayings are closest to 10? Do we have any couple or 1 or 2 maybe that are not, they don't have to be 10, but like which are the closest 7, 6, whatever that is? Which are the highest on that ranking, in your opinion?
Well, there's a number of Q sayings that scholars of all sorts pretty routinely attribute to Jesus. So one of them would be Q620, which is "Blessed are the poor." Now, I mentioned right at the beginning that there's a disagreement between Matthew and Luke in how they frame this. That is, Luke says, "For yours is the kingdom of God," second person plural, and Matthew says, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven," third person plural, using kingdom of heaven instead of kingdom of God. But they at least agree on the blessing of the poor. Now, one of the reasons I think for attributing this that Q saying to the historical Jesus, and as I say, most reconstructions of the historical Jesus will include that one, is because it's triply attested. It occurs in Q, which means it shows up in Matthew and Luke. But it's also Gospel of Thomas 54. And there's an echo of it in James 2:5. So this is a saying which, at least in my view, can be probably attributed to the historical Jesus, because it shows up in 2 or 3 different locations. The saying on divorce, prohibiting divorce, in Q, this takes the form that the man who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. That appears in Q 16. It occurs in Mark, and it's cited by Paul as a saying of Jesus in 1 Corinthians. So you've got 3 different, I think, independent attestations of it. That, for me, would constitute a reasonably good ground for saying that probably does go back to the historical Jesus. Sayings that are singly attested are only in one source. It may be harder they may not be number 1 on your scale, but there may be still good reasons for attributing it to Jesus. But the ones that show up in 2 or 3 independent historical sources, I think, have a better chance of going back to Jesus than some other ones. So I would say that divorce saying, the blessed are the poor, the parable of the mustard seed is one that shows up in Q, in Mark, and in the Gospel of Thomas. So 3 different sources, and there's a few others. Even the saying that appears in Q11 about seek and you will find, for the one who seeks finds, and so forth. We get an echo of that in the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. There's an echo of it in James, and it shows up in later early Christian literature. That's actually, it's attested in about 5 or 6 different places, versions of that seek find thing. And so that would be the place that I would start in analyzing the Q sayings. I'd look for the ones that show multiple attestation, that also appear in Mark or Thomas, or echoes of it, say, in John, or echoes of it in Paul or in James. Those are the ones that I would say most probably go back to the historical Jesus. The ones that I would say, I think the kind of famous saying that doesn't go back to the historical Jesus, at least in the form that we have it, is John 3:3, which is, unless a person is born ANOINTED, he cannot see the kingdom of God. That saying that we have in John 3, it depends for its rhetorical force on a pun that exists only in Greek. That is, it's the word anothen. If you read this dialogue with Nicodemus, so Jesus says, I'm just going to use the Greek word at the crucial point. Unless one is born anothen, they cannot see the kingdom of God. Now, anothen has a double meaning in Greek. It means either again, or it means from above. And it's clear that John constructs this dialogues, and Nicodemus, his response indicates that he thinks that anothen in this context means again, because he says, for how is it possible for a man, who's fully mature, to enter his mother's womb and be born a second time? And then John has Jesus rephrase the saying, and he says, unless one is born from the Spirit and water, one cannot enter the kingdom of God. So at that point, it becomes clear that Nicodemus should have taken anothen to mean from above, and then the saying would have made sense. But the very fact that the whole rhetorical effect of this saying plays on a pun that's available only in Greek, not in Aramaic, would suggest to me that, at least in this form, Jesus didn't say that. Now, there are sayings in Mark and special sayings in Matthew, and in Thomas, which suggests that there may be a precursor, the saying about becoming a child and entering the kingdom of God. That may be a kind of precursor of John's version of this born again saying, because unless one turns and becomes a child, one cannot enter the kingdom. That is a saying that seems to suggest some kind of radical reorientation of the self in ways that are kind of normally impossible. And that saying, because we've got versions of it in Thomas, we've got a version in Mark, and we've got a second version from another saying that Matthew records. That, I think, has a better chance of being historical Jesus. And then in that case, we would say, I think that John knows something of a saying like that, but he decides to frame it in a much punchier way, using a pun that only works in Greek. And now it becomes rebirth rather than turning and be like a little child or something like that. So I'd say John 3:3, not from the historical Jesus.
And so, see, as I've been pointing out as we've been going through this, the real Jesus and his real cult with Professor Kloppenborg, like, this is your scholars, right? These are their theologians. These are their, so-called, people who they look to, they read about, they tell us, they take their information. We're always having to argue with. But like I pointed out earlier, look at the double standard. Clearly here, the way they're seeing the formation and the way theologians are seeing the formation of the New Testament is based off of a Q source and also an early document of Mark, which they believe both Matthew and Luke both share from both of those sources, Q and Mark, and everything else that we went through. And notice how even here he just outright says, no, the historical Jesus didn't say John 3:3. You see, but when David said something, to the effect of, Luke chapter 1, apart from the first 4 verses roughly, or later, added to the original content and it can't be taken, he comes underneath this whole, oh, well, see, this guy's antichrist, this guy's in a cult, this guy's, wicked. I can't talk to this man anymore because he's a hypocrite. All of the above, man. But every single one of these scholars that they've been bringing out to us the whole time, this is them. This is how they talk. This is what they say. So, for all intents and purposes, I guess their leaders of their religion, their scholars and theologians are all Antichrist cult members. I mean, at the end of the day. But I'm going to continue with this here. If anybody wants to say anything, you just raise your hand. Remember the yellow hand. I saw Joseph come off mic. You want to say something, Joseph? All right. And so, yeah, anybody can raise their hand, whatever. And I'm going to keep going from here. So, yeah, John 3:3, he says, clearly this is a later development. You see this? It's like not a question. It is what it is. Okay. Go ahead, Abio.
Where'd you get this recording from?
I'll share that with you. People might know where it's from, but Gnostic Informant, it's the interview with Professor, I have the name there, Kloppenborg. So if you just type into Google the real Jesus and his real cult, and then the name there, Professor Kloppenborg, then you'll find it.
Interesting. Are those people like Christian? Like they believers or are they just whatever?
Do what?
Are they believers or are they like just their own thing?
But the interviewer, he's kind of his own thing. He's not a Gnostic, for example. He uses Gnostic. He's called the Gnostic Informant, but his main point of view is not. He's not a Christian Gnostic by any stretch or means. He's a person that looks at religion eclectically and tries to figure out where all these things originated from. And his position is he thinks a lot of things really arose with the Greek culture. Like he even suspects that the Torah or Tanakh wasn't really put together underneath the Persians, but rather there was a more orchestrated event in Alexandria because he's found things like Alexander's name in cuneiform writing, which is super old stuff. So the Greeks knew this old super cuneiform writing and stuff, and that's been lost today. And but no, that's when he says Gnostic, he just means knowledge, and that's what he means. He means knowledge in the sense of just information, as you see here. The guy he's interviewing, I don't want to get him wrong, so let me get a little bio on this guy, the professor here. All right, so John S. Kloppenborg, right, born 1951, a Canadian professor of religious studies with expertise in Greco-Roman culture, Judean culture, and Christian origins. So that's the guy we're listening to, and that's why I wanted to play this, because you know how people are. Oh, what scholar do you have for this? This is the main guy, and this is his expertise of study and teaching. All right. Greco-Roman culture, Judean culture, and Christian origins, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels and the Q source. So this is the guy. Kloppenborg is at the University of Toronto since 2007, where he holds the title of University Professor. He was elected a member of the Studitorium Novi Testamenti Societas in 1990 and was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2014. In 2019 to 2020, he served as the president of said organization before. He is also a member of the Context Group, the Society of Biblical Literature, and the Canadian Society of Biblical Studies. He was awarded honorary um, doctorates from the University of Lethbridge in 2011 and the University of Pretoria in 2018. He received his MA in 1977 and his PhD in 1984 at the University of St. Michael's College. Um, and he has taught and conducted research in Toronto, Windsor, United Kingdom, Jerusalem, Cambridge, amongst a lot of them. He is one of the general editors of the International Q Project. So he is one of the general editors of the International Q Project you heard being talked about earlier. And his research contributions are as such. John Kloppenborg studies the origins of Christianity, early Christian documents, and the history of the Second Temple Judaism. He has researched and written most substantially about the Q document, also known as the Sayings of Q Gospel. So y'all can thank me for this later. This hypothetical document would be one of the oldest circulating sources of the sayings of Jesus. So David, you should just adopt this as your main guy. It is hypnotized as prior to and known to the authors of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, but he has a different theory than you when it comes to the compiling of the New Testament and what's oldest. And is similar to some ways of the non-synoptic Gospel of Thomas. He has also worked extensively on the synoptic problem and co-edited a major collection in 2011 on the publication of William Sandy's Oxford Studies of the Synoptic Problem. And I'll read this part. Critical edition of Q, published in 2000 by James M. Robinson, Paul Huffman, and John S. Kloppenborg. Look at that guy. Big guy, isn't he? The critical edition of Q, synopsis including the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Mark and Thomas with English, German, and French translations of Q. And you remember why I used this guy earlier? Because he was telling you that the way people read the words in the Bible today are no way connected to the way that these things were anciently thought of. So I'm going to keep going with the interview here. This is the guy that's being interviewed. So this is a
How
big
much
time guy.
longer is
This
it?
isn't just your little old regular dude. What do you say,
How much
Abio?
longer is it?
I have it fit 16 minutes
All right, perfect.
approximately. All right.
In the way it's been framed, but there may be something behind it that is historical Jesus stuff.
Do you know of any areas in the Greek world where that pun is used at all?
I don't know offhand whether we've got other examples of the pun, of that word functioning as a pun, but we've got lots and lots of instances of the word in Greek being used sometimes to mean again and sometimes to mean from above. We got lots of examples of that. John, the author of the Gospel of John, likes puns, and he uses some the word hupsao to either to glorify or to lift up physically is a pun that he uses. Now that's a pun that also works in Aramaic, right? There's an Aramaic word that has both the sense of to lift up someone physically, as on the cross, and also to lift them up socially or in terms of reputation, that is to glorify them. So John, there are puns in John that would work in Aramaic, but the John 3:3 doesn't. It only works in Greek.
Wow, that's fascinating. Is there any other examples like that you think, yeah, he didn't say that?
Well, one example would be, we have a number of sayings, say from Q, that indicate that Jesus is willing to associate with disreputable, with persons who have some level of disrepute. So tax collectors or toll collectors. So we've got in Q a saying. Jesus says, to whom shall I compare this generation? That is his fellow Jews. They're like children in the marketplace who say, we piped and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. For John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and you said he's demon possessed. And the Son of Man, self-reference, came eating and drinking, and you said that he's a glutton and a drunk, a friend of tax collectors. So that, and we've got a number of sayings in Mark that suggests that Jesus associated with persons of that particular group. Now contrast that with Matthew 18, where this is material that doesn't show up in other sources, where Matthew is elaborating some disciplinary features of a Christ group. So if someone sins, you go to them privately and see if you can convince them to do otherwise. If that doesn't work, you take another person and encourage them. And if that doesn't work, then you treat them like a tax collector. So, I say to my students, what does that mean? Does that mean you have dinner with them? No, clearly. Matthew says treat them like a tax collector. In other words, you throw them out. You do not associate with them. But that's in pretty interesting tension with this other stream of material that you find in the early phases of the Synoptic Gospel, which indicate Jesus does associate with tax collectors, and isn't about to rebuke them or throw them out of his company. And Matthew is even willing to imagine that one of Jesus' disciples, Matthew, is a former tax collector. So I'd say the Matthew 18 use of the Matthew 18 Jesus saying probably doesn't go back to the historical Jesus at all. It reflects somewhat later stage of the organization of Christ groups, where it's important to decide who the pious are and who the impious are, and the impious you exclude. But this, I think, already belongs to a phase of the development of organizational practices within Christ groups, where you have to come up with disciplinary rules. Many of the associations that I work on similarly had disciplinary rules. So, being a disturbance at the group's banquet might be enough of a reason to get you expelled.
Interesting. And then you, any evidence of early Christ assemblies having connections to assemblies to pagan gods?
I guess it depends on what we might mean by connection. That Christ groups knew about other assemblies, I think, is pretty clear. If one thinks about 1 Corinthians 8-10, where Paul addresses the issue of whether a Christ devotee should participate in a cultic meal where the meat has been sacrificed to a pagan deity. So this is the kind of activity that occurred in pagan temples. It also occurred in a number of pagan associations where their meal would have begun with a sacrifice of an animal, and the sacrifice then, part of the sacrifice is offered to the deity, and then the devotees eat the remainder of the sacrifice. So I think it's entirely possible that in Corinth, Paul knows perfectly well that there are other groups devoted to other deities and cultic meals. And one of the issues that he addresses in 1 Corinthians 8 is it okay for Christ devotees to attend those? As they seem to have been doing, and his answer is try to dissuade them from doing so. If one looks at the letter of Ignatius to the Ephesians, this would be from the very early part of the 2nd century. Ignatius describes a Christ group using the terms that belong to Dionysiac associations. So he says that you are Christ bearers, Christophoroi, and you are Neophoroi, temple bearers. And he uses a whole series of words that end with this suffix phoros or phoroi, a bearer. Yep. Now, that's typical vocabulary of Dionysiac associations, where there are basket bearers, Phasmophoria. Exactly. So there are and what he's describing is a kind of procession of a Christian procession, where each of these members has a different phoros name or a phoros function. They're a bearer of Christ or the temple or something like that. But that vocabulary comes straight out of understanding how Dionysiac groups divide their devotees into certain classes of basket bearers and phallus bearers and so forth. So now that doesn't mean that I think that means that he knows perfectly well what that vocabulary is, because he knows about Dionysiac groups and he sees them, he hears their vocabulary, and he adapts them. It surely doesn't mean that his Christ believers are members of a Dionysiac group. For all we know, they could have been former members.
Let me run something by you real quick. As someone who's you're a professor, you're an expert, and I'm just an amateur reading this stuff and for fun. Let me run this by you and get your opinion. This is the last thing we'll talk about, because I've recently had come up with the hypothesis that some of these early Christians are converts coming from Orphism, and the reason why I think that is for a couple of reasons. When we look at Clement of Alexandria, he's really like focusing on these Orphic traditions, and even saying like Christ is the new Orpheus, singing the song of salvation. He says that in his exhortation to the Greeks. You also have in some of these early catacombs pictures of Jesus looking like Orpheus. Mm-hmm. And the last thing
with a sheep on his shoulders.
Yes, and then you have Paul talking about, listen, guys, you might show up at a dinner and they might offer they might give you meat that was sacrificed to an idol. It's all right, just chill out. Unless it trips your brother up, then don't do it. And I'm thinking, who are these people associating with? And when I look at the Orphics, they're a lot similar in their piety and their religious devotion. It seems to me that this could be part of their early Christian transition, that these people were, for whatever reason, more likely to convert to Christianity. What's your thoughts on that?
That's entirely possible. I'd also point, at the beginning of 1 Thessalonians says, everybody's heard how you turned from idols to serve the true and living God. So Paul here I think he's citing what's common knowledge between him and the Thessalonians, namely that at some point they were not Christ devotees. They were devoted to other kinds of deities. He doesn't say which kind of deities there, but Dionysus is a possibility. Orphism is
which is big in Orphism. The Dionysus, the Thesmophoria, that's all Orphic stuff. And not to mention the Derveni Papyrus is found right in the smack dab in the middle of Thessalonica.
Yes, yeah. So it's entirely. This is entirely possible. I think it was Bob Jewett that wrote in his book on Thessaloniki, argued that there was a connection to the cult of the Kabiroi, which was sort of a quasi-mystic cult. That's possible. The difficulty that we have is Paul doesn't actually say very much about what groups they came from, and it doesn't give us much of a clue about what they had originated as cultores of some other deity. But we do have examples in antiquity of persons converting from one deity to another. One of the famous examples is Elias Aristides, who is this famous hypochondriac from the 2nd century, where when we first tune into him and can read his material, he's very devoted to the Greco-Egyptian deity Serapis. He writes a hymn to Serapis and so forth. But there's a point at which he seems to decide that Asclepius is better for him. Both Serapis and Asclepius are healing gods, but Asclepius is also connected with rhetoric. And he's a rhetorician, and in the latter part of his career, he seems to be much more interested in his devotion to Asclepius and not to Serapis anymore. So there's an example of somebody sort of switching deities. One of my former students, Zeba Crook, has written extensively on this notion of shifting from one deity to another.
Nonus converts to Christianity. I think he wrote the Dionysica.
Right. Yeah, and then he writes this sort of allegorical poem about Christianity. So you get people switching. It's a really interesting question. Why? That is, what does the new deity have? What benefits does the new deity offer, or the new group offer, that the older deity didn't offer? Presumably, there was some reason for the conversion. It's either that one deity has offered benefits that the other didn't have, or maybe the social group. Maybe there's more attraction of that social group. There's something about the social glue that holds them together that's more appealing.
You know what I think is a good way to look at that is compare how people leave certain Christian denominations to go to other denominations. Like somebody might leave the Catholic Church because, whoa, these Baptists, they really have the real gospel, and let's go over there. Or maybe the other way around. I mean, someone's like, yeah, these Baptists are a little too right wing for my taste. I'm going to go to this Catholic church, and look how nice this church looks. Oh, look at all these statues. Maybe those are some things that you can compare to in the ancient world, how people switch over.
Yeah, those kinds of comparisons are really useful. It's there has been an interesting correlation between American evangelicals converting to Greek Orthodoxy, and you would think, boy, that's not an intuitive change to make, but it's observed all over the place that it happens, and one might then suggest that there's a certain appeal to the amount of ritual that you see in Orthodoxy that you don't see, incense and vestments and all of that may have its own attraction. Another kind of interesting comparison that Rodney Stark has made is to look at conversion by the Mormons, where the Mormons, I think one of the motors behind Mormon conversion is the strength of Mormon groups, or the strength of Mormon socialities, that you belong to a Mormon group and you're in a sense fixed for life for social relations, strong and healthy social relationships. It may have nothing to do with theology. It may have to do with the kind of internal cohesion of these Mormon groups, and especially for people who feel a little alienated or a little, disconnected from their own groups. A Mormon group is a great one to belong to. That conversion, I think, can happen both for kind of theological reasons, and it can occur for entirely social reasons. That and Stark has also made the interesting point that in the 3rd century, when the plague of Cyprian hits, both Christians and Jews cared not only for their own, but they cared for their pagan neighbors. And even though Christians some Christians would have likely succumbed to the plague, which was maybe smallpox or maybe even bubonic plague. It's unclear. But for pagans who had been cared for by Christians who recovered, then the likelihood of conversion goes way up. If someone has saved your life through their care and through their God, then that becomes a powerful incentive to take their God pretty seriously. So that may have been one of the motors, Christian behavior and Jewish behavior for conversion. Julian the Apostate is very unhappy that Christians did this, and he's even more unhappy that pagan priests didn't do it. That is, they tended, to hightail it out of town when the plague hit, rather than caring for anybody. So that's conceivably also one of the motors for conversion.
Wow, I really enjoyed this conversation, and links for the books in the description. Anything else you want to say before we go?
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for your time, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis.
All right. So that's the end of that matter there.